Hello, everyone. My name's Greg Masters. I'm the managing editor of SC Magazine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webcast, Exposing Risky IT Security, Best Practices from the Testing Trenches, sponsored by IXIA. We're seeing it in the headlines almost every day. The networks of large and small enterprises in every vertical, as well as government entities, are being attacked and penetrated, and the valuable data housed on the premises and on cloud servers is siphoned off, a treasure for cyber attackers. What can you do to shore up the security architecture of your organization? Our presenters today will be discussing best practices for data-driven security decisions that ensure secure and resilient networks. We have three speakers for this session. Fred Coast is Vice President, Enterprise Solutions at IXIA. Fred manages and markets IXIA's security and applications test portfolio. Jason Cain is a network analyst specialist at Fidelity National Information Services. He has spent the last 12 years supporting test labs and producing networking and security platforms for large ASP environments in the financial services industry. Limor Elbaz is the founder and CEO of Peerlyst, a community of security professionals. Just a note, we will have a Q&A following the presentations, so we encourage you to send in any questions you may have via the interface at any time. Fred Coast will be speaking first. Welcome, Fred. We're pleased to have you with us today.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for everyone who's joining us today. Well, with a title like Risky IT Security, it definitely sort of garners attention. And I think if you think about risky IT security, you're really betting the business, and we're going to talk a lot about this today, but, you're betting it for two things. One, you're trying to defend against bad things happening, but you're also kind of on the offense. You're trying to enable the business and allow the business to do things. And so when we think about risky IT security, I think we need to think about both of those perspectives, not just the how do I keep the bad guys out. Now, when many of you registered, we laid out some of the goals and what we wanted you to learn. And between myself and the panelists joining us today, we really want to share some strategies that will help you make data-driven technology investments. Many of you lead organizations and you're day in and day out making decisions on what technologies to deploy. We want to try to share some best practices on how to use data and get good information to make those decisions. But also want to talk about the importance of realism and scale as you're staging these technologies and preparing to roll them out. Without sort of that real-world perspective, you may open yourself up for surprises when some of these new technologies are rolled out into a production environment. So we want to share some techniques and best practices there. And then finally, we want to think about the cloud and virtualization. A lot of these projects you're tackling take on a different aspect when we think about the cloud and virtualization. So through our panel discussion and sessions today, we want to make sure that we touch on that as well. So that's what we want you to get out of it. Briefly, we're joined by two great panelists. One, Jason Cain will bring a great user perspective from Fidelity National Information Services, lots of experience, in those trenches, as we said in the lead-off title. And also we have Limor with us, she is one who's also trying to advise organizations and help you make sense of all this and make good decisions. And so I think both of them will bring a extremely valuable perspective as we go through today's presentation. So the real world is harsh. Greg had some opening comments, and imagine you're in the recent week or two, it's been the Anthem chief security officer, someone in the security team at Anthem, and you wake up and you've got a headline, you've got to think about how do we notify our customers, how do we clean up and recover. It's a very harsh world that we live in these days as a security professional, and it's sort of you're wondering when will it be my turn with things happening. But also, it's a harsh world for organizations trying to make, product decisions, services decisions on what will they deploy in their network. They're bombarded with information. It's sometimes hard to see clear, what this product will do, how effective will it be on my network. So it can be equally harsh for those of you attending today and constituents trying to deploy security. But then finally, the reality is the world is harsh. I mean, we're seeing, all kinds of traffic loads from many different devices. Emerging threats and new attack techniques that change almost daily. So you're thrown into a landscape where you're trying to defend against some really harsh conditions. And so it does make for a tremendous challenge for most organizations. But it's not a challenge that we're not trying to solve. It's security actually seems to be a problem looking for a solution. One of the leading analyst firms estimates that there'll be almost $77 billion spent on information security in 2015, and that's a huge amount of products and services. But if you think about it, we see things like next generation firewalls continuing to emerge, organizations trying to deal with cloud and virtualization as they build out private public cloud infrastructures. How will they secure and test that? We have things like mobility with any device from anywhere, creating diverse devices from all kinds of locations using all kind of applications. And so there are a lot of security challenges that need to be solved just from the technology changes that are going on. But as an organization, what criteria are you using to make decisions as you invest that $77 billion? Is it a return on investment? Is it a total cost of ownership? Is there some sort of performance or security effectiveness I need to measure? How do I really begin to assess what security I'm going to put in place, and then what is the security success that I'm putting in place? So one aspect I'll introduce is this idea of security resilience. And I talked a little bit about performance and security, but if you think about metals and the definition of resilience, a metal or an object that is bent or faces a lot of stress, resiliency is its ability to bounce back. So if you think about metals, things like iridium are very, very brittle. They're hit with something that's going to break. Things like sort of nickel, titanium alloys, copper, they're much more flexible, much more resilient. They can bounce back or bend back into shape. And I think that's something when you think about security as we're making some of these decisions. For instance, when I'm building my network and putting security in place, things like a DDoS attack, am I resilient to that? Can my security embrace it, sort of mitigate it, and then bounce back? Or if I think of things like for instance, maybe a next-gen firewall or something where I'm doing a tremendous amount of content inspection, when I see a burst of traffic that requires maybe more than usual content inspection, is my security able to sort of comprehend that and then quickly bounce back so that I continue to do business as I should, but I've been able to sort of filter out bad traffic or do that inspection. So it's those kind of things that the resilience is getting at. Security resilience is something that the government and a lot of critical infrastructure providers talk about because they realize the importance of having that resilience. And as enterprises, I think it's time to sort of begin to allow this to creep into our vocabulary and think about how is our security performing in all kind of real world environments. Now, if you want to think about resilience and making some of these, purchasing decisions of that $77 billion, where does an organization turn today? And there's actually lots of places to get information. I've captured a few here. Places like NSS Labs do, very good actual product testing, look at security effectiveness, and can really sort of assess how will a product perform under certain conditions. And I think they strive to do real-world kind of stress test conditions. You have things like the SC Magazine Awards. It's, someone's looked at the product, someone's written something, but how much can you rely on that? The vendor data sheet. Vendors publish data sheets. They're real specs. They've tested them. But is that really going to mimic your application mix and what's happening on your network? Then you have organizations like the Institute for Applied Network Security, where there's actual end users like yourself meeting, sharing information, sharing best practices, letting one another know how a particular product performed in my network or what kind of test I performed to assess its resilience or performance. Obviously, we have analyst organizations who talk to lots of users, sort of follow technology trends. That's another input. And then media sites such as searchsecurity.com, where you might download white papers or other information to learn about the technologies. No one of these has no value or is the perfect answer. It's kind of a mix of end user information, third party validation labs, media, vendors. They all come together, and it's up to you to sort of make sense of all that. And today, we'll go through some of the things you can do to make sense of it, but it's particularly challenging. I think everyone agrees that, as a starting point, that, testing is pretty important. Testing anything before you deploy it and roll it out is sort of standard best practice. And when it comes to security and security assessments, I think we're often focused on vulnerability assessment. and doing things like a pen test or vulnerability assessments, looking for unpatched servers, or doing some sort of audit testing. And many times it's driven from a compliance perspective, but it's very effective at least getting a baseline of where we are and identifying some things we need to work on, whether it's an unpatched server or shoring up some sort of social engineering vulnerability we have because it was surfaced in a pen test. Moving forward, thinking about the topic we're talking about today, the idea of security resilience testing is really focused on, how can I do real-world testing with real attacks and real load that I might actually see on my network? And how can I assess some of these new technologies and even new systems where I have a layer of security to make sure I'm maximizing my investment? Either I'm buying the right amount of security or putting the right things in place. And really understanding my readiness to do business so I don't have security incidents or even downtime incidents that my security has triggered because I didn't plan to do this. And historically, it's been sort of larger enterprises that focused on this, but we're finding more and more that more organizations of all sizes are beginning to embrace this idea of I want to test and assess things, particularly in the security realm, before I roll them out. So I want to hand it over to Jason, who was introduced in the beginning, hands-on guy who's doing this, really represents the end-user perspective very well, to let sort of shed some of his experiences and light on how he makes these decisions in his role at Fidelity National Information Services. So, Jason?
Thanks, Fred. Just to set the stage, I am one of those lucky guys who works at a historically very large enterprise that has the luxury of working with generally the top end or a lot of toys in terms of playing. From an enterprise test lab perspective, our mantra usually runs down the test your platform as you would run your platform. We consider the end-to-end service delivery of traffic as the entire platform. We don't test solely on the component level. We mock up the entire thing from user to service and test it all the way down. If you're playing with a new widget, you want to see how all the knobs work, component level testing is fine, but it's really not sufficient. You do need to test scale, security, and function from end to end, and that is what I've been doing and seen other people do for the past few years. Conversely, everybody seems to be running a continuous development lifecycle. The second somebody has an idea, you really want to run it out the door from a software development lifecycle. That then drives us on the service delivery platform to have a continuous, always-on test bed that needs to be available for anybody to try practically anything. And that leads to a number of different problems, conflicts in scheduling and equipment availability. It's expensive and it's time-consuming, but I would argue, much like football teams and a lot of other allegories you can make, you're mostly paid for practicing. You're not necessarily paid for the plays. So you want to spend all your time and all your lead time on working in the test lab, working with your environments, in a safety of a lab to make sure you find all the problems before you run it out the door. There's no secret sauce in that, but that is really where you need to hold the line. Something that we've seen coming down now over the past 4 to 5 years is the word cloud, of which I'm one of those people who hates that phrase, but it's still out there. With private and public cloud rollouts, something I've noticed is that a lot of people seem to think that it fundamentally changes the game. When it comes to security and operational security and delivery testing, public and private clouds rollouts really don't change the whole concept of platform testing. They just change the mechanisms of how you test. They might make it easier. They might make it more or less expensive, but the concept of testing your platform as you would run your platform still really doesn't change. The one thing that I have seen that a lot of people seem to not get conceptually, which sometimes helps to think of it this way, is we like to use an amended application development cycle. A lot of the people I communicate with. You come up with an idea from a dev perspective, new platform, new service, new software, whatever have you. You can go ahead and develop it all you want, but we insert a platform testing cycle in between development and UAT. So from a software development lifecycle, we shim that extra step in there as a best practice, and that means that we know this idea can actually serve in scale, security, and function before it ends up going to UAT, and then the pressure is really on to get it out the door. So from my perspective, those are the big topics that continually roll around myself and others that I work with. So that's about what I got, Fred.
Great, thanks, Jason. And for those on the webcast, we're actually going to open up for kind of a panel and then a Q&A in a little bit, so we'll hear more from Jason. Limor, welcome. As we said, Limor is kind of an interesting role. She's one of those advisors, and so Limor, maybe you can walk us through some of what you're seeing as best practices and tell us a little bit about Peerlyst.
I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. So Peerlyst is basically a community that's dedicated to security professionals. We're, like Ixia, we're a vendor-neutral company. We're an unbiased platform, and the idea behind Peerlyst is really to enable security experts to share resources and knowledge and expertise. So you can call it a community of practice. And if you look at the next slide, you can see some of the early adopters of Peerlyst, and they really assist us from a variety of industries, all sharing similar challenges, the stuff we've been talking about, the difficulties in really mitigating risk, but also understanding where you are. If you move to the next slide, as you see, one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is that the security market is really experiencing a huge deficit of talent, and it's very, very hard to get new talent, productive, to train new people in this industry. I'm sure everybody who's listening to us understands, having been there and done that. Certifications don't necessarily say really what you're capable of doing, and talent is becoming a serious bottleneck on adopting new solutions and mitigating risk these days. And so Peerlyst is seeing a lot of interaction now between students and people who are new to this cybersecurity space and mentors, and we're trying to really foster those relationships and create new talent. I wanted to talk a little bit about, in the next slide, a little bit about deploying a new product. So we're all so busy with, buying new products and getting them going. We all know that security is always about best of breed, right? Any security solution you're about to deploy is going to be a best of breed solution, and that's a big problem because we have to constantly learn what's our next defense. And that's kind of part of our job between, taking care of existing fires, existing projects, and the cycle of really from identifying a new need you have, whether it's because you read an article or you heard about a new breach or a new type of attack, but from the time you actually identify that you have a need through the time, you get to learn about this new vector of attack or new defense, through the time you actually need to take to select a new product and then implement it, it's anywhere between 3 months for the very most simple, maybe service-based solution to even as long as 3 years is what I've seen with, organizations like big banks or Fortune 100. There was actually a recent study by Osterman Research that was just released showing that companies have increased their security budgets. They're buying more products than ever, but a significant portion of that software has actually transformed into shelfware, which is very concerning. And this is because of the complexity of deployment, complexity of testing, that things actually work for you. So it's a really false sense of security that sometimes we as security professionals are giving the business. So I'd say we need to maybe buy less and deploy much more. My last comment is really what we're trying to do at Peerlyst is our goal is to really enable more sharing of knowledge and know-how between people who are really trained to be paranoid, and rightfully so. So we want to help you guys share knowledge and put together better security solutions and mentor new professionals and find experts and understand what's trending. And as part of that process, we have partnered with Ixia to really give the opportunity to share that knowledge. So essentially, Peerlyst and Ixia will actually be giving some evaluation licenses of the BreakingPoint product in its virtual machine version to users on Peerlyst who are willing to put their security to the test and share in the form of a blog or discussion or whatever, share on Peerlyst with their peers how that product performs, to really push the vendors to do better, but to also have a conscious, decision and really kind of look at the mirror and see if your product is doing what it's supposed to be doing and not just have a false sense of security.
Okay, thanks, Lamar. Okay. Well, actually, it's not quite it for you yet. So I want to make sure that we bring back Jason Lamar and talk about some of these challenges and kind of have more of a kind of open panel discussion. And I've got a few questions or ideas that I wanted to throw out to you guys for the audience. But the first one to get us started is you talked a lot about investments and shelfware and some scary ideas. But if you look at, when you're trying to choose new technologies like a next-gen firewall or some of the sandboxing, breach detection systems, balancing performance and security and really knowing what's right, particularly the newer technologies, it applies to firewall and IPS as well, can really be kind of difficult. So, both, from all perspectives, what advice or what are some of the best practices for making these decisions, whether it's a, maybe tried and true technology like, traditional firewall or some of the newer security technologies that organizations are trying to deploy?
Should I go first? Please, go ahead.
All right. I do have to say, Lamar, the phrase you had, buy less and deploy more, I couldn't agree more with that. Jumping off of that, one of the best practices I've always found, and we try to hammer into people's heads, is that you have to know what you have first. I mean, usually everybody's starting from a position of having a few things, widgets, tools, pieces of equipment, whatever. You have to know the capabilities and features and functionality of what you've currently got and what you're attempting to defend or what you're attempting to roll out before you even start making product decisions. You want to be an informed consumer. You want to decide where your constraints are, where your desires are, where your growth patterns are going to be, and really clearly make sure that you understand where you're going so you can ask the intelligent questions of the people who are, out there with the tools and the systems you might want to purchase. At that point, then you can decide whether you're going to collapse things together in a tool that, does what you need to do, or whether or not you're just trying to shore up one particular function because everything else you have you're satisfied with.
I would add to that just that, I know there's been a lot of talk about the recent breach for, the healthcare and insurance company, and eventually now people are talking about the fact that the breach was actually identified by a coincidence, not because some database security monitoring tool actually said that there is a breach or there was an activity that shouldn't have been identified, but rather by a coincidence, an IT admin found that there was a transaction, there was some SQL query done with their ID that they haven't done. I think it's a perfect example to the fact that people should be really not just deploying less products, but making sure that they work. And that means testing them and retesting them on a regular basis to really make sure that things actually work, because it's just like buying an alarm and having the battery die on it. And then it's like, it's nice that you have an alarm, but if it's not working, then what's the point? So we already know that 70-80% of organizations have deployed a firewall, and I'm sure the majority of them are in the process of deploying the next generation firewall. But I think at the end of the day, it's about identifying what are the assets that are important to you, and keep having that regular check that that what you think is working to protect you is in fact protecting you at the moment.
Oh, I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. Actually, being an expert at what you currently have, I couldn't agree that that's probably the key to making good decisions as well as, practicing before you play.
Yeah, and it's interesting you both mentioned sort of, what do you have now and really understanding that. And I think also even, from the Ixia perspective, understanding what you have now in the form of, what applications am I running, what devices do I support, what does my network really look like today? Because if I'm going to decide to put a new security device or solution into that mix, I really want to understand, what do I have now so that I can make sure it's a smooth, seamless transition to sort of deploy that security product, and that I'm making the best security decision I can. So making sure I can sort of do some test and assessment against what I have today. Moving along, another question I want to kind of throw at you guys is, historically in security there's been a lot of focus on vulnerabilities, and granted now it's beginning to shift more to maybe 0 days or unknown malware and such. But there's a lot of variables in the equation, whether it's we've got more and more encrypted traffic we have to think about. Attackers are being more and more clever in how they attack. Application mixes are extremely diverse. And, so we've thought a lot about sort of the vulnerability side of security, but what about, this idea of security resilience and ensuring that your security can really stand up to what, we've kind of talked about as the real world. Thoughts on, how an organization should pursue that?
From my perspective, we diverge ourselves into two different tracks for security resilience and real world challenges for security, both testing and validation. And that's logical security or information security, i.e., protecting what the gold behind the gates, and then operational security, as in making sure that your infrastructure is up and running. And those are really two fundamental different technology trains and thought patterns that have to be thought through. I'm a network guy first, and then I'm involved in security by, I don't want to say necessity, but I'm involved in security because that's important to the network from an operational perspective. So a lot of the testing and a lot of the work that I'm involved in is just in terms of making sure that the infrastructure is up and running. Everybody says security is paramount, but realistically, if you ask them the question, would you rather turn your infrastructure off for a week or suffer a breach, I would wager the answer is they usually suffer a breach first, because nobody can survive being down for a week. So from that perspective, operational security is highly important, and there's no substitute for always testing and testing every possible option for your operational security mechanisms to make sure that your filters are working, your whitelists are working, your DDoS protection is deep enough to keep you down or keep you up and running, to make sure that you have defense in depth for IDS, IPS, firewall, deep packet inspection, etc. And then you layer information security on top of it from both an infrastructure and an application perspective. And that's where you have the continuous process testing of every particular component of a service chain, so that you can make sure you're not leaking vital information, through those day zero exploits, through, well-known things that you should know better and, were solved 8 years ago, but if you don't change the defaults, it's going to fly right out through an SQL query anyway. So that we separate ourselves out into two separate trains from that perspective, to make sure that you can truly focus and have people trained to focus on operational security versus information security.
I would add just a couple of points here, Jason. I totally agree with you. I think that I actually just read SANS released an analytics survey, and 55% of the respondents said that they had the average time it took them to detect a breach from the time a system was actually impacted was 1 week or less. And what you got to remember when you hear these numbers is that, okay, there's another 45% of the respondents that actually needed more than a week, but also even the 55% that needed a week or less, this was from the moment the breach has happened. Some of the damage had already happened. So I think if you really don't want to be in that situation, and it's really scary. But if you don't want to be in that situation, the only way for you to do that is to have somebody else or something else, like a product, like a testing product, looking at your resilience and testing your resilience. I once bought kind of a tray from MoMA, and they said this will never break. This is a special glass that would never break. And my first instinct was I wanted to drop it on the floor and see if it breaks or not. Now, how do you do that when it comes to security? You need to have your own kind of database of malware, but that's not going to help you with the next targeted attack. So I think the only way to do it is really have an outsider person or program testing your existing solutions by running as much payload, as complicated payload as you can through them, and try to learn from it. Maybe you're not going to have the next attack tested, but maybe you'll have the next attack vector tested. Maybe you'll minimize your impact by that next attack. So I think that's the most you can do realistically.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't imagine a situation where we don't test, retest, and then test the third time on a regularly scheduled basis. Everything, including things that you depend on and you haven't tweaked for 6 years, you still test them again. And figuring out not only whether or not things break or whether or not they can be penetrated, but how they break and what they look like when they are penetrated is almost as important as proving that they can't break, because then you at least know what to look for. If you don't understand how your firewalls collapse, do they just shut off, take their ball, and run home, or do they try and limp along, dragging themselves and operating slowly? If you don't know how that's going to happen and know what to look for, you won't even understand when something actually does go down. If you don't know how your databases are going to respond under regular load, how are you going to know when, they're being brute force attacked? So I agree. You have to test it.
Yeah. Hey, and Jason, not to put you on the spot here, and not looking to divulge any confidential information, but I'm curious. You talked about you've got to do both protect the gold and sort of keep the infrastructure up and running, and you see tests kind of help and play a role in this. Without getting into specifics of your network, but I mean, what are a couple of the discoveries you've found that either allowed you to protect the gold better or keep the infrastructure up and running that if you had missed may have caused problems?
Oh, let me see if I can think of something here. Well, for example, just using the firewall, for example, under DDoS load, for different types of firewalls from a few different vendors, we went out and in the test lab, we decided, what type of firewall do we want to have facing the internet? Do we want to have a type of firewall that will continue to attempt to operate when it reaches 100% of its rated load? Or do we want to have a firewall that's going to shut off cleanly and just collapse so that, nothing goes through because it bends, it goes through, it takes the interface down. In that particular case, we were running a situation where it's a multi-data center environment and we want to have, for example, we want to use BGP to run through the firewall levels so that we can have operational redundancy. If you were interested in that sort of operational redundancy, you don't really want your edge firewalls crippling themselves and attempting to limp along. You want them to break cleanly so you can go somewhere else. So that's the sort of information that allows you to design your network, design your security, based on testing. How do I want this to operate? How do I want it to break? And what's it going to look like when it breaks? So that's an example of that type. And different manufacturers are going to have different sort of break and operational patterns. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's the choice you need to make when you're trying to figure out how you want your infrastructure to operate.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen a similar thing, and it sometimes even goes beyond the product. We've seen customers also want to do some sort of testing of their DDoS mitigation strategy. And I'll call it a strategy because even though they're deploying some products and potentially services, cloud scrubbing or something, they really want to exercise what happens when we come under attack. What is how does the device perform? What about my own internal team's communication processes? What about the linkages back to some sort of scrubbing service or cloud-based service? How is all that going to come into play when I face a real-world attack? And so, similar to your example of how a firewall behaves, we've seen interesting customers wanting to really understand what happens when we face that kind of attack or that kind of load, so they've gone through a drill and can understand how everything will perform, take away some of the risk.
Well, another example of a friend of mine, and I'll leave him unmentioned for now, but they thought they had everything nailed down perfectly, and they did test their edge information, edge security. They tested their firewalls, they tested their IPS, they tested their IDS. It was all great. What they didn't do was incorporate their management systems into their tests, and then they came under attack via an actual a fairly complex day zero exploit. So it wasn't a heavy load attack, but the IDS did catch it. Great. Unfortunately, their IDS set off such a blizzard of reports that they were under attack that their monitoring system collapsed, and they spent, a day and a half, 2 days just trying to figure out what in the world is going on because they didn't understand how to tamp down the load of their reporting. And that's the sort of esoteric kind of secondary order problems that you find in the trenches if you don't practice monitoring your platform and testing it out. You're not going to know that happens until everything explodes and your NOC's hair is on fire and nobody knows where the attack is coming from because nobody can get into the systems to, find out where the reports are coming from. Those are the sorts of things that you find out when you test. And
I would emphasize also the fact that the retesting is equally important because it's organizations are dynamic. I mean, Peerlyst, for example, we're moving our web service to Dockers, and when you move to cloud or you make any change in your configuration, or you just upgrade your web services, or you change a component. We just went through a Grails upgrade and we found out that there's new vulnerabilities with Grails, so we had to put new measurements in terms of security, but had we not tested it, we wouldn't even know about it. So I think you just have to keep in mind your organization, the configuration of your infrastructure constantly changes. So you want to put yourself to the test all the time. But another thing is you want to tell vendors what you need them to do better. You can't do that if you don't share that information, if you don't talk about this information, if you just go back and forth with the vendor saying, oh, I think this is not working, and the vendor says, oh, try this, tweak that. It's just not enough. Sometimes you just really want to push them to do better. And that's another thing that we really are trying at Peerlyst to kind of push users to do, to go out there and share what they can, what's not confidential, so that, vendors improve.
Oh, absolutely. I love networking, I love security, I love the IT industry, but you really can't trust anybody. You have to do the trust but verify. And it's not like it's deliberate, but there's so many moving pieces. I mean, half the stuff we work on, and I'm a huge fan of the open source movement, it's all done by human beings. If humans are involved, you're going to have problems. They update OpenSSL, and you don't know, but something you've got hidden in the weeds is dependent on that. You didn't understand that it got tweaked with the latest patch updates. You have to keep testing. I mean, the good news is a lot of this stuff changes and gets better day after day after day, but the bad news is you have to keep testing it just to make sure that the things you trust are actually still there.
I think also the fact that components that are coming from different vendors, whether it's your infrastructure or actually your security products, that have to play together. I know that having worked for vendors in the past, one of our biggest issues was always interoperating with other security vendors and making sure things play together and not kind of either block each other or interrupt each other. So I think that just as an end user, there's no other way. You have to put things to a real life test.
Right, which is why I keep referring to everything as a platform. If you're running an IT shop, your entire IT infrastructure is your platform, and you have to test it end to end. You just can't trust that individual components are good enough. That'd be like the car manufacturer saying, "Yep, my wheels are round." Well, we put 5 of them on it, but the wheels are round, so they should all be good. You have to test it bumper to bumper.
Yeah, and I think that was an important point that you made through some of the examples, that a single device performance and behavior is one thing, but when you put it together, you string together multiple devices such as the monitoring systems and, detection systems, the way they work together could not be what you might expect or what you planned for. I want to keep us moving, and Jason, you've talked about two things. One, you've talked a lot about platform, but also going to kind of go into the word space of cloud, and I know you've expressed your perceptions earlier, but clearly most organizations are deploying virtualization in cloud and call it what will, this pushing things outside, in the case of public cloud or some private cloud, hybrids and such. We talked about a lot of challenges just in the old world and the way things have been, but how does this, how does an organization gain confidence of their security and performance now that, perhaps things have become even more nebulous, or does this perhaps make it easier?
I don't know that it makes it easier. My opinion is that cloud, especially because I've been working in an infrastructure that could rightly be called cloud for, my entire career. It doesn't necessarily make it, in my opinion, harder or easier. It's just a different way of doing things. Virtualization does help significantly in a lot of ways, and that's why we're all moving towards it. But it still doesn't change the concept of you have to test what you're planning on using. I don't see that fundamentally changes that basic tenet of working in IT. I think what might be getting tied together in a lot of people's minds with cloud is the fact that we're now reaching the point where people start needing IT, and they start needing their infrastructure, their network, their security, their data, kind of like how we need electricity and plumbing and the roads. You can't afford for them not to be there. The pace of innovation has been, torrid over the past 20 years when it comes to connectivity and new widgets. And I believe actually it's going to start slowing down a bit because we have to take the time to test these things out end to end because they are so critical to everybody's mission. And in terms of rolling it onto the cloud, whether it's public or private, it just changes how you test it. It changes where you put your testing boxes. It changes where you generate your traffic from. It changes, how you run your penetration tests. If you're running everything within a private cloud stack, for example, you can't plug an external entity into it in order to generate load and give you test because you're conceivably running everything within the hypervisor. So you just need to be able to run those tests within the hypervisor. That's the only difference so far that I've seen as I've started moving closer towards VMware NSX and OpenStack. The tests are different, but they're fundamentally doing the same sort of thing. They're proving the same sort of concepts.
Yeah, I want to actually present another side of this coin. Just like we as businesses are moving some of our infrastructure to the cloud, some of our data, some of our assets, we have to keep in mind that security vendors are doing the same thing. And so what happens is security vendors are starting to offer some of their products and services, and that's a new thing for them too. So that means that their code has changed. That means that their products are now different, and they're working in a different environment. They may be hosted in a multi-tenant environment with a bunch of other products. Your security infrastructure is now playing in a different playground, and it may not be working the way you expect it to be working anymore. And that transition actually presents new risks to you. And you got to keep in mind, when you move your infrastructure to the cloud, you haven't moved your responsibility to anybody else. You haven't really moved your responsibility for the security of your business to the hoster. So you really have to now be aware of two changes. One, the changes happening with your own infrastructure, and the other is some of the changes happening with the security infrastructure, because your products are now playing in a different way.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that, as these things are, slightly more distributed and sort of outside of those boundaries, and you think about tests, how do I easily roll test out? I think test has been thought about as more of a sort of centralized resource somewhere over in that staging lab or that physical facility, and so we've got to figure out how to make it easier to push test out or do testing across all these different environments.
That's true. The one thing I will point out, which may sound like I'm contradicting myself, but the one thing that the cloud, either public or private, does impact people, which dicing hairs as to whether or not it's fundamentally different or not, but the speed at which people can make mistakes that expose your infrastructure to some sort of problem is most definitely rapidly increased by moving to, something like the cloud. You want to order up something really quick and make a mistake in building that operating system or loading a web server on top of it and expose everything just because you had the right credentials to, hook it into a database that it didn't belong talking to. That can happen much, much quicker now that somebody can just do it all virtually. So that in and of itself is definitely an aspect of moving to the cloud it's not really a technology problem so much as it is an organizational and a management problem of making sure that, people understand the guns fire faster and, the bombs will get there quicker.
Okay. Well, Limor and Jason, thanks for the great conversation on some of the topics. I want to shift gears a little bit, and Limor, something you talked about earlier, was you talked about a virtual edition of BreakingPoint, and actually, those attendees today that aren't familiar, Mixia has a platform called BreakingPoint that has been used for years by the equipment manufacturers, carriers, even enterprises to test and validate security, typically on high performance, sort of dedicated hardware, but to really test out security and application performance. And just this morning, we announced a new platform. Actually, we've now virtualized that, so that the BreakingPoint platforms is available to run in a virtual machine. And so we think it's really going to help organizations, roll this out in a way that's more aligned with some of the things they're doing today from an IT perspective, and provide tremendous flexibility to solve some of these testing challenges that both Limor and Jason and I have all highlighted this morning. So the BreakingPoint Virtual Edition is really, as I described, the BreakingPoint software running in a virtual machine. So you get tremendous flexibility deployed across an organization, but also it gives you a lot of elasticity. You can bring up instances of virtual machines with BreakingPoint running in them to scale a test up, or maybe you need a small, simple test. It's just a simple instance. But to get to some of the scaling that Jason was highlighting, we can actually bring up multiple instances of BreakingPoint in a virtual machine. And the packaging is such that it's done in a subscription model, so it fits well with kind of operating models where you may be procuring tools or services under an operating model. So it's simply a software subscription for deployment. So all that makes it very, very easy to deploy. You no longer are kind of looking at one physical location or a physical hardware device to do testing. You're actually now got a tremendous amount of deployment flexibility as you roll that out. So in the end, it's really going to help you sort of build that resilience we've talked about. The sort of trust but verify, I think was mentioned earlier, really is the theme here. Allows you to build and test out the network so it performs like you think it will. And something we didn't talk a lot about, but it really helps you sort of maximize that investment. There's a theme of maybe buying less product, trying to get more out of the product you have. By having a test tool that's easy to deploy, you can really do that. So as you're, picking products, building an architecture, you can right-size those devices, make sure the architecture works like you think it will, and in the end actually, make a better investment or maximize the value of your investment. And really do all these things faster. There was a theme in the conversation today about, cloud and virtualization may move things along, make them move faster. I think that's absolutely true. By having a virtual edition of a test tool, you can actually move quicker and help the business move fast as they embrace, cloud and virtualization. Test doesn't have to slow that down. So very interesting capabilities in the BreakingPoint platform itself. From a product perspective, sort of jumping in another level, so BreakingPoint is basically running on VMware hypervisors and OVA, and it's structured in such that, in case you're not familiar with BreakingPoint at all, there's a controller. So essentially, a controller that's running all of the BreakingPoints, supporting the idea of virtual blades or these vBlades. And so a controller can support up to 12 blades, each blade, software blade, having up to 8 ports. And so you can get up to a total of 96 ports on one controller. And again, all this is running on industry standard hardware, so it's not a platform such as Ixia's Perfect Storm, which you may be familiar with, that BreakingPoint has been traditionally delivered on. This is running on a virtual machine in your environment. So fits the model of a lot of other things you're deploying and removes that sort of Ixia hardware dependency. You can actually mix an environment. So if you're a current customer or you have some places where you're using dedicated Ixia hardware to do testing, such as a Perfect Storm 1 or Perfect Storm, you can actually blend that deployment with virtual instances as well as instances on a physical device. And the controller can actually scale, so you may have a controller and these blades running on one physical host, or you might actually have a controller running on one location or a physical host, spanning virtual controllers spread out across different locations. And so, in some of the environments that Jason spoke of earlier, they may have distributed testing or things taking place in lots of different labs. You can actually have those blade instances spun up there, supported by a single controller, one place in the organization. So this fits that flexible deployment model that we were talking about. And just to sort of back up, not specific just to the virtual edition of BreakingPoint, but when you think about real-world testing, our customers do it in two configurations. One is what we call one-arm testing, where they're using the BreakingPoint software to actually create the traffic, both good traffic and malicious traffic, to understand that behavior, pushing it through a security device or a layer of security devices or infrastructure to the actual servers or applications that are running, to get an idea how that performs and sometimes how even the back end is performing. The other configuration is what we would call a two-arm testing. So BreakingPoint is actually creating all of the traffic as well as terminating all that traffic. So, for instance, when you may want to measure latency or certain performance characteristics, or you don't have the back-end infrastructure in place in a lab, this allows you to test all that, test the layers of security in a fully two-arm configuration. So flexible depending on your test lab environment, production live network, what you had to test with, different configurations to perform the testing using BreakingPoint. So with that, we also, in the registration process, I think it said that someone was going to win an instance of a BreakingPoint Virtual Edition. So we will notify the winner later today. So everyone who attended today's session, someone will get an email notifying you that you've won a BreakingPoint Virtual Edition instance. For those of you on the call that want to download and do an evaluation, today on the Ixia website, you'll find it on the top of the website. If you go to ixiacom.com, there's a link to the virtual edition. You can request a trial, to download a trial, and try it out for yourself. So I encourage you to do that if you're interested in exploring tests further. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions, and for Jason, Lamore, and myself, we'll go through some questions here. And I'm going to go through, I'll kind of read some of them. I haven't screened these, so Jason and Lamore, bear with me. But small to medium business, safe to say they understand the need to deal with DDoS and technologies and how to leverage them. But what about volumetric attacks against our location, say 6 gigs sustained to an IP address over our 300 meg link? Businesses may not know what is happening by looking at the edge devices. And so I think here, looking for advice on how they might, what to look for, what to do, and maybe Jason, you might want to comment. You talked about some of the tests I think that one of your colleagues is doing at the edge or something, or Lamore, feel free to comment.
I mean, first off, if you at all possible, you build a test infrastructure so you know what it looks like on your edge when somebody does that. And in terms of actual protection, edge protection is one of the hardest things to do because realistically, the internet kind of doesn't support not being able to protect being able to protect yourself from something outside of your doorway. Just from a generic technology perspective, you usually end up going with one of the services that they build a bigger door and they guard the door for you. There's really no way to protect yourself from a determined attacker who's just going to volumetric crush you. You got to work with your provider to make sure you use the mechanisms they have, and you might need to get an alternative provider that sticks themselves in between your path.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I think what we've seen from our customers is testing or creating some real-world scenarios will help you see what it looks like and what steps might be necessary to mitigate that or address it, because understanding what the real impact looks like is important.
Yeah, I mean, experiencing it yourself, setting it up in a lab environment so you know what it looks like, that's, I'm not going to say easy, but that's doable, and it's something that as you grow and as you become more dependent on your internet-facing edge, you have to do that. But knowing it and being able to completely protect against it are two different things. And, unfortunately, you need somebody else's bigger hand to usually protect yourself. But knowing is most important, because otherwise you just won't understand why, what's going on. It's up, it's down. These people are reporting it works. These people are reporting it doesn't. You really do need to build the edge up to the point where you can get decent infrastructure and decent knowledge. And fortunately, that's not horribly expensive. It just takes the time and the wherewithal to make sure that you practice it. Because if it only happens 3 or 4 times out of a decade, you may lose that edge. But you definitely do want to work through it. And it's like fire drills. You hope your building never catches fire, but you still practice.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one last question. Another one: what tools are there to collect, define the attributes and catalog information and security assets, and then to measure ability of those assets to resist an incident? I'll comment on that first and maybe kick it back to you guys. I think, there's a lot of different, tools to scan and inventory what assets you have and such. And so I think that's one important step. But the second part of that is, really trying to understand how each of those assets perform. So a particular device in isolation, how does it perform? But also, as we've talked about today, making sure you understand the layers. And so I've got a monitoring device that's being fed by a, detecting device, understanding how those assets perform when they're under attack or, high volume of incident.
Everybody under the sun seems to have a widget that falls under that classification. I would wager that most medium-sized companies probably already have a tool that does something like that. So I'd look at it and make sure you don't already have it first. And then if you do, figure out what you do and don't like, and then start beating the bushes for something that actually fulfills those goals. That's a fairly common.
I would actually add, just because the request on this question is pretty very well defined. You can actually go on Peerlyst and see do a search for tools by certain categories, and we definitely have asset discovery tools listed on the site. As I mentioned, we're vendor agnostic, but you can definitely find a lot of different vendors there, and without mentioning, I can think of a few names of companies that provide asset discovery and testing tools on the site.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not rare. There's lots of quality stuff out there, so definitely that's a great idea.
Great. Well, we're right at the top of the hour. So first, Jason and Limor, thanks for joining us today. It was super informative. It was great to have you with us to bring those, both end user and sort of third-party perspectives. So thank you. And also thanks to everyone who attended. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you have questions, you can visit the website, ixiacom.com. There were a few more questions that we'll follow up afterwards. But with that, thanks, everyone, and I'll hand it back to you, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Yes, as Fred said, this will going to have to be it for this session. Let me thank Ixia's Fred Coast, Fidelity's Jason Cain, and Peerlist's Limor Albaz for sharing their insight and expertise today. And, of course, our thanks to all of you for tuning in. If we didn't get to your question, our panelists will be getting back to you by email to resolve any questions. This webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Magazine website under the Events tab. And at that place, you can download a PDF of the slides as well. So with that, thank you, everyone. Good day.